Stand. On behalf of the Australian Defence Force, I sincerely and unreservedly apologise for any wrongdoing by Australian soldiers. I've spoken directly with my Afghan counterpart, General Zia, to convey this message. Australia, I am sincerely sorry for any wrongdoing by members of the Australian Defence Force. You're right to expect that your Defence Force will defend your nation and its interests in a manner that accords with our nation's values and laws. Turning to the Inspector General's report, he found none of the alleged unlawful killings were described as being in the heat of battle. None were alleged to have occurred in circumstances in which the intent of the perpetrator was unclear, confused, or mistaken. And every person spoken to by the inquiry thoroughly understood the law of armed conflict and the rules of engagement under which they operated. These findings allege the most serious breaches of military conduct and professional values. The killing, the unlawful killing of civilians and prisoners is never acceptable. It's my duty and that of my fellow chiefs to set things right. Accountability rests with those who allegedly broke the law and with the chain of command, responsible for the systemic failures involved, those failures which enabled alleged breaches to occur and go undetected. In order to deal with what happened, we need to understand how it could have happened. I'll offer a preliminary view based on both the Inspector General's findings and my own professional judgment. It starts with culture. The report finds that some Special Air Service Regiment commanders in Australia fostered within the SAS what Justice Brereton terms a self-centred warrior culture. A misplaced focus on prestige, status and power, turning away from the regiment's heritage of military excellence fused with the quiet humility of service. The report notes that distorted culture was embraced and amplified by some experienced, charismatic and influential non-commissioned officers and their protégés, who sought to fuse military excellence with ego, elitism and entitlement. As units became consumed with preparing for and fighting the war, much of the good order and discipline of military life fell away. Cutting corners, ignoring and bending rules was normalized. What also emerged was a toxic competitiveness between the Special Air Service Regiment and the 2nd Commando Regiment, destructive of trust, cohesion and mission, and a disgrace to both. Not correcting this culture as it developed was a failure of unit and higher command. Turning now to the challenging counterinsurgency environment of Afghanistan. People detained would be released if there was no formal link that linked them to insurgent activity. Catch and release, as it came to be known throughout the coalition, was frustrating and carried with it some risk, but it was also understood to be a necessary measure, a point of balance between the needs of security and the needs of justice, both essential in a counter-insurgency campaign. In this context, it's alleged that some patrols took the law into their own hands. rules were broken, stories concocted, lies told, and prisoners killed. And once that rule was broken, so too, for some, was any further restraint. Those who wished to speak up were allegedly discouraged, intimidated, and discredited. Here I want to emphasize again that the overwhelming majority of Special Forces personnel did not choose to take this unlawful path. No matter the stress and the strain of battle, they remain true to our values and our laws. They are truly special. Special because of the self-discipline and the courage they constantly displayed. They upheld our culture of service over self. Culture also affected reporting. The Inspector General finds that troop, squadron and commanding officers of some Special Operations Task Group rotations indirectly contributed to alleged criminal behaviour. This occurred in a number of ways, but particularly by accepting deviations from professional standards, by sanitising or embellishing reporting to avoid attracting attention, and by not challenging or verifying accounts given by those on the ground. Oversight mechanisms, such as legal reviews, operational assessments, and inquiries took place, but they were not sufficiently rigorous or independent. Individuals and processes were either suborned into the culture that had emerged, obstructed by it, or frustrated by the silence it bred. This inquiry found no evidence that there was knowledge of or reckless indifference to the commission of war crimes on the part of troop, squadron, and commanders of Special Operations Task Groups and higher command. However, being unaware of or even deliberately kept unaware of actions, unlawful actions, does not relieve commanders of moral responsibility. And the report finds task group commanders bear responsibility for what happened under their command. Higher arrangements for command and control were found to be too dispersed and too distant to consistently give effective direction and control to Special Operations Task Groups. While commanders at many levels described the status of Special Operations Command as stretched but manageable, none appreciated that reporting and governance systems, which routinely described extraordinary performance, were no longer reflecting the whole truth on the ground. Reporting was positive, and soldiers and field commanders alike showed genuine enthusiasm for their campaign and for their participation in it. Nevertheless, higher command should have recognised sooner that the units of Special Operations Command were unable to sustain all the demands placed upon them. Justice Brereton considered in detail 57 allegations of incidents and issues. He found there to be credible information to substantiate 23 incidents of alleged unlawful killing of 39 people by 25 Australian Special Forces personnel, predominantly from the Special Air Service Regiment. Those alleged to have been unlawfully killed were all people under control, in lay terms prisoners, farmers, or other civilians. This shameful record includes alleged instances in which new patrol members were coerced to shoot a prisoner in order to achieve that soldier's first kill, in an appalling practice known as blooding. Further to this, throwdown weapons and radios were also reportedly planted to support claims that people killed were enemy killed in action. Some of these incidents took place in 2009 and 2010, with the majority occurring in the latter years of 2012 and 2013. Alleged perpetrators deployed on between 1 and 5 Special Operations Task Group rotations over the period 2006 to 2013. I have accepted all of the Inspector General's findings, and a comprehensive implementation plan is being developed to action his 143 recommendations and any additional measures necessary. I will lead this effort, supported by the Chief of Army and other senior defence leaders. We will report progressively on a quarterly basis to the Minister for Defence. The Independent Afghanistan Inquiry Implementation Oversight Panel will have complete access to our work. The recommendations deal with 3 main issues: culture, command, reporting and governance, and within that wider context, individual and collective accountability. Firstly, in terms of culture, Army has, in parallel with this inquiry, driven a comprehensive reform program within Special Operations Command over the last 5 years. This program focuses on ethical leadership, good governance, and command responsibility. While much good progress has been made, the report notes that elements of resistance to change and professionally corrosive attitudes or behaviours persist. The Inspector General's recommendations will strengthen and accelerate Army's reform of Special Operations Command, which will continue. The allegations contained in this report are a tragic reminder of why the authority, military excellence and small team autonomy, so necessary for special operations, are only secondary factors in our military success. Prime always is the nurturing of character and culture, so that our people derive the strength to do what's right in the most difficult of circumstances. Defence senior leadership are committed to sustaining and promoting good culture based on defence values and behaviours that empowers and enables military capability. We have no tolerance for anything else, and we will strengthen and drive ethical leadership training across the force. Secondly, our command, reporting and governance will be improved by strengthening command and governance arrangements within and of Special Operations Command, by revising the Australian Defence Force's model of command and control arrangements of special operations within coalition operations, by enhancing the record of action for Special Forces patrol operations through the use of digital technology, by improving the capacity, continuity and independence of review and inquiry processes on operations, and by strengthening the Inspector General's role in operational oversight. Thirdly, with regard to individual and collective accountability, individuals alleged of unlawful criminal conduct will be referred to the Office of the Special Investigator. Individuals alleged to be negligent in the performance of their duty will be managed through administrative and disciplinary processes. Where decisions were made in good faith, individuals and the force more generally must learn from this experience, and we will embed this training into our development and education system. As proposed in the report, I will review and make recommendation to the Governor-General with regard to the honours and awards received by a range of officers, both in Australia and Afghanistan. Units live and fight as a team. The report acknowledges, therefore, that there is also a collective responsibility for what is alleged to have happened. With this in mind, I have accepted the Inspector General's recommendation and will write to the Governor-General requesting he revoke the meritorious unit citation for Special Operations Task Groups who served in Afghanistan between 2007 and 2013. Separately, the Chief of Army will today also announce changes to the Army's order of battle, that is, its organisational structure. While necessary, I appreciate that these latter decisions will be a bitter blow for many. The report includes some very recent lines of inquiry, only partially considered by Justice Brereton's team. If anyone has any new or additional information, I strongly encourage them to bring it to the attention of the Office of the Special Investigator once established. In the meantime, please pass it forward to the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force. A redacted form of the inquiry report will shortly be available. To ensure the procedural fairness of potential future investigations and possible court proceedings, I cannot, however, release Part 2 of the report, which deals with specific incidents and individuals. In conclusion, I thank the Inspector General, Mr. Jim Gaynor, and Justice Paul Brereton and his team for your comprehensive and tireless efforts in bringing together the Afghanistan inquiry. I also acknowledge Professor David Wetham for his important contribution to the inquiry's consideration of systemic factors. And I thank everyone who's come forward to speak to the inquiry. Your contribution will help make us a better force. I would also like to acknowledge the work of Dr. Samantha Cromfitz, who first brought this issue to Higher Command attention, Major General Jeff Sengelman, who had the moral courage to confront it, and Mr. David Irvin, who's been assisting us with Special Forces reform. I know this inquiry has taken a considerable toll on our people and their families. We will continue to support those affected, and I encourage anyone who needs to seek assistance. I again acknowledge and thank those many thousands of Australians who served in Afghanistan and did the right thing, professionally and with honour. And this includes many of our Special Forces personnel. You did extraordinary work. The actions of some do not represent the integrity and value of your service. You should be rightly proud of your contribution to our nation's history. Today marks an important but difficult step forward for the Australian Defence Force and our people. Thank you for your continued service to this great nation, ethically, lawfully, and in a manner that speaks to our lived values of service, courage, integrity, respect, and excellence. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll now take questions.
Okay. There you go, and now we know. 23 incidents. 25 personnel who committed 39 unlawful killings. 19 personnel referred for prosecution, which seems to imply that 6 people committed unlawful killings under orders, which were illegal orders. Video was titled ADF Report into Afghanistan War Crimes by SAS, announced by General Angus Campbell. It was on ABC News Channel. Their comments were disabled. There you go, young AceDestroyer in Belgium. For those of my subscribers who are not acquainted with the AceDestroyer, yeah, I'll have a crack at writing it. Check this young fella out. He's a noted, celebrated historian of World War One and World War Two. And when I first encountered him, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, he came up in the suggested, recommended, related videos scroll underneath a video of mine that I put up, which was the first time I videoed the Anzac Day ceremony here in my local town of Glen Innes. And at the time, I think he was about 12 years old, and he'd been getting around the Belgian World War One Allied war graves cemeteries, and he'd been kitted up with a slouch hat and a backpack, looking quasi paramilitary, adorned with English, Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian flags, and going around the cemeteries. And he had pre-located on the internet portrait photos of people who were buried in the cemetery, and he laminated these photos onto between sheets of plastic, and he was videoing himself hiking around the cemeteries, putting photos of the dead on their graves. And his cinematography skills weren't the greatest, so I subscribed to him and began commenting and making suggestions, and he's been listening to some of them and exceeding expectations on all fronts. And I think he's probably got 5, 10 times the number of subscribers that I've got, but I can remember when he didn't have very many. Two or three of the feathers that are in his cap, even though he might be 18 years old, just a school leaver in Belgium at this point in time. Pretty sure he did his final year's school exams this last year. He has personally researched to the point where the British War Office has accepted his conclusions, analysis, and from deductions, and they have put new headstones or engraved names on headstones of 3 British Imperial servicemen who died in the First World War, who were otherwise buried as missing, identity unknown. I think to have done that much before leaving school is outstanding, and I've always been impressed by the idea that somebody who grows up surrounded by military graveyards and centuries of martial tradition would have to be affected by it. And yeah, the AceDestroyer is a kind of a case in point. He makes some of the most brilliant, incisive documentary videos about what I would regard as minor footnotes in the First and Second World, particularly the Second World War. He'll make a 5 or 15 minute video telling you who was in which tank, who was in operating which anti-tank gun, who was commanding each one of the platoons, and what happened when a hill in the middle of nowhere beside a crossroads that nobody ever heard of took up the concerted attentions of 150 or 300 people for a day and a half 70 or 80 years ago. Yeah, and he'll make it comprehensible with maps, still photos, careful cinematography, and selected, sometimes repeated, sometimes reversed, dipping into the reserve of newsreel photography from back in the day when there were film cameramen running around on all sides all over World War II. So anything that didn't get actually put in a landfill is probably in a film vault somewhere. And this kid is bloody great at playing with his computer and finding it and using it to illustrate and narrate. And I'm 59 and I can't speak Flemish or Dutch or German or French or Belgian or whatever it is that he grew up with as a milk language. He speaks English beautifully. So several months ago, I warned him in the comments thread that this was coming, that, the Australian military had finally, after years of investigation, come to the conclusion that at least a couple of dozen people in the Special Air Services Regiment and the Australian Army Commandos had been doing some really, really, really evil shit in Afghanistan. He said he found that interesting and he'd have a bit of a look at it. I said I'll keep him posted. So here is the update, young fella, me lad. Some of the people who volunteered to fight for Australia and went to Afghanistan between 1 and 5 times over a 7-year period, they did some really, really stupid things. I mean, we've recently had highly public scandals regarding greyhound trainers using live cats, live possums, and live rabbits to blood their greyhounds to make them run faster when they're going around a track chasing the mechanical hare. And apparently, Angus Campbell says there was a bit of a hardcore of warrant officers in the SAS who were secretly beyond the knowledge of their superiors, who either looked the other way or were dumb enough to be trained to look the other way, who were out there blooding the new troops, the reinforcements, the people on their first trip to Afghanistan, blooding them by ordering them to shoot prisoners. I have heard it said by a veteran on Remembrance Day, not so very long ago, that some of these people had been out there 3 or 4 or 5 times. I have heard it said on the media by an ex-veteran, an Afghan veteran, that if you're doing your second or third or fourth rotation back to a war that nobody in Australia really gives a shit about, everybody figures it's a stupid idea that was started by the Americans, and Johnny Howard just dived into it because, the ANZUS Treaty, because in 1940 and 41, when all of Australia's army was fighting in the Libyan desert and preparing to fight in the Libyan desert, in the Egyptian desert, and all the Australian Air Force was in the Middle East or in England fighting Germany and Italy, a lot of the people in Australia kind of noticed that there was only one modern monoplane 1,000 horsepower fighter with aircraft with closed cockpit, retractable undercarriage. It lived in Melbourne. It was a Mark I Hawker Hurricane with a wooden fixed pitch air screw. It had no guns, and it was only ever flown to attend air shows and perform aerobatic displays over recruiting rallies and for events to promote the sale of war bonds. So there were people who kind of felt that Australia was in a defenceless position. They felt so defenceless they commenced to build fortifications in case the Japanese came down through Southeast Asia and the islands after having taken over French Indochina, which used to be called Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos and Vietnam. So their theory was that there was nothing to stop the Japanese if they wanted to keep on coming and land in Darwin and then use their little light tankettes and bicycle battalions to cross Australia from northwest to southeast. So therefore, Australia's defensive preparations consisted of the Brisbane to Melbourne line. And they actually built a major overhaul airfield at a place called Tokemwal, which was southeast of the Brisbane to Melbourne line, and it was supposed to service all the aircraft that were going to be defending Melbourne, Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong, and Brisbane from the Japanese who were expected to attack overland. Here, where I sit on the top of the Great Dividing Range, just north of Glen Innes, I am on the western side of the Brisbane line. I'm in the abandoned part of Australia. That's how low morale was in Australia before Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, when America got into the war, kind of as soon as the Philippines fell, we got General MacArthur. He came here and he told everybody to stop preparing to defend the Brisbane-Melbourne line, to dismantle the Tokemwal Air Base and put everything up in northern Australia to support what he wanted to do, which was fight the Japanese on the islands where they were. And ever since then, Australia has been kind of like America's pet tame attack train Chihuahua. But it kind of went a bit awry because Australia was defending New Guinea and America was attacking the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal took them 9 months or something to actually capture one island. And after that, when Australia had stopped the Japanese from advancing overland towards Port Moresby, there was Boona and Gona and Wewak and Ley and Sanananda, and there were all of these places where joint operations were tried, and the Americans who were fighting in New Guinea were not the ones who had experience on Guadalcanal. They were fresh from training camps, and not to put too fine a point on it, they often lay down and sort of refused to advance into enemy fire, and they had to be rescued when they got themselves trapped, pinned down, and they called on Australians to help them out. And when New Guinea and Bougainville had been either secured or abandoned by the Americans because they wanted to keep going north, the Australians got left securing perimeters around abandoned Japanese battalions that had no supply from the homeland because they were cut off. And the Americans advanced towards the Japanese home islands, and they didn't take any Australian infantry with them, apparently, so it said, because MacArthur didn't ever want to have any more help, 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 can the Australians come and bail us out, we're pinned down type messages from American forces who wanted to be rescued by the Australians. So I've heard, so I've read. It's what was supported by the collective social oral history as told to me by those of the 2,000 Australian veterans who fought in in every war Australia's been in from 1914 to 1984. The ones who fought in the Pacific alongside and kind of behind the Americans, because Australia got stuck fighting on Bougainville until the atom bombs caused the Japanese to surrender. The Americans just pulled out and said, that's it, we've helped the invasion, you guys can clear up. That's what the Australians had to say about the Americans and their involvement in Australia's corner of the war against Japan. They didn't want to be embarrassed by the Australian Imperial forces, so they left us behind. Took our Navy. Our Australian Navy fought in American task forces all the way to the end, fought in British task forces all the way to the end. But the Australian infantry, yeah, they stayed on Bougainville and New Guinea. But after World War II, Australia got into the ANZUS Treaty, Australia, New Zealand and United States. And the theory was that the communists needed to be stopped, and Australia and New Zealand couldn't defend ourselves because we couldn't defend ourselves against the Japanese, who never ever wanted to invade us. But anyway, that meant that we were at risk from a communist threat of invasion, generally perceived to be coming from Indonesia, because they were rebelling against the Dutch colonialists who were monarchists, so therefore the Indonesians must be communists. So that's why we went to Korea, so that America would protect us from Indonesia. And that's why we kind of went into Malaya and Borneo, and that's why we went into Vietnam. We didn't go into East Timor until John Howard became Prime Minister, but there's always been this fear of the yellow peril from the north that's kind of been in vogue since the Crimean War, will we say? Before the Crimean War. Australia's been afraid of the yellow peril from the north for a long time, and that's why we are staunch allies of America. And therefore, when America decided that they'd been attacked by somebody who was a house guest of Afghanistan, America wanted to go and occupy Afghanistan. Australia went to occupy Afghanistan, and I thought it was a pretty silly idea from the get-go. So I did, and I wrote letters to the editor of the newspaper. So I did. And for the sheer unadulterated wibnifery of it, let's see how much of what I wrote I can locate in my files, which are, as you can see, in the Schmidt house. Beside the broken wind turbines and broken aeroplane propellers, on the other side from the aeroplane propeller that broke when my old mate got his throttle cable wrapped around his cooling fan. But yeah, down in here, I have an awful lot of letters to the editor. And maybe I can find the one that I'm thinking of. Okay, so we dig really deep beyond the cobwebs. Pretty sure the one I'm looking for is going to be in here. Let's hope it's not the one that's missing. And as I had feared, the particular letter I was after is missing, but there's not a bad runner-up in the pile that runs from 1998 to November 2001. It was probably one or two papers before this that the actually crackerjack letter appeared, in which I posed the question that if Australia was to get involved in Afghanistan because America wanted to go and invade and occupy Afghanistan because somebody who was a guest of Afghanistan was supposed to have somehow been responsible for 3 buildings falling down in the middle of New York when 2 aeroplanes hit 2 of them. Okay. Johnny Howard was in New York when it happened, so therefore Australia had to send Special Air Services forces off to Afghanistan in advance of anything the Americans did, because, you know, when Madeleine Albright told Sad Man Who's Insane that America was not interested in minor internecine border disputes among its Arab client states, and he decided that meant he got a green light to go into Kuwait, and all of a sudden all of NATO decided they were going to fire off their entire anti-Soviet stockpile. Australia said, oh yeah, we got to go in there, so we sent our SAS into Iraq in 1991. Yeah, that meant that the Labor Prime Minister had been Australia's wartime Prime Minister, and Johnny Howard was in New York when the Twin Towers fell down, and he wanted to be Australia's wartime Prime Minister. So he sent the Australian Special Air Services Regiment into Afghanistan in 2001. And here we are, 19 years down the track. You've just seen what the head of the Australian Army's got to say, or the ADF has got to say about what we were actually doing there for 7 years, killing civilians, killing prisoners, blooding our troops by letting them kill prisoners. Here's the second best letter I wrote 19 years ago. Blind Revenge. I write to express some views regarding the Australian involvement with the great British-American revenge attacks upon the sovereign nation of Afghanistan. Due to that nation's unelected government having given shelter to an angry Saudi Arabian who is said to be a political fanatic prone to twisting an otherwise peaceful religion in order to justify his use of violence. He also seems to have orchestrated the kamikaze Boeing attacks of September 11. Traditionally, the way to lose on the field of strategic warfare is to build a large armed force in peacetime, then attack a series of weak adversaries until overconfidence leads to an attack upon an enemy which has greater staying power than the antagonist. The German Kaiser lost World War I that way. Hitler and Tojo lost World War II doing it. America lost in Vietnam that way, and now John Winston Howard finds it something less than melancholy duty to be joining in an aggressive attack by the world's richest nation on one of the world's poorest. Not only is Australia to send warriors, but the usual peacetime payment for polishing the guns, feeding well, and staying fit to fight the hypothetical attacker, well, apparently that's not enough when it comes to being shot at. Now it seems to go near a war requires an extra tax-free $150 a day, while to set foot on the ground nets a mercenary $200 a sunrise. What was that about patriotic national duty? To go near a war requires an extra tax-free $150 a day, while to set foot on the ground where battle's happening gets an extra $200 per sunrise on top of that. I am perilously close to being personally nauseated by the levels of spiritual and religious hypocrisy in the commentary which has been emerging from the media. Being as I am a faithist rather than a Muslim or a Christian, I believe I may be objective in regarding both sides and what they say. The Quran doesn't translate jihad as a holy war, but as, quote, the struggle to live in the ways of God. Yet it does sanction fighting back against an attacker, and the Muslims have a long history of defending themselves against alleged Christians out on what they called the Crusades, which the Pocket Oxford Dictionary defines as a holy war. It has been claimed that Islamic fanatics believe they'll go straight to heaven should they die in battle, and this has been taken as implied proof of the moral and ethical superiority of the Christian nations now attacking Afghanistan. I wonder how many of those Christians who died in the September 11 attacks are now assumed to be in limbo, purgatory, or in hell for their sins while alive, or are they all now saints in heaven, their souls washed clean in a martyr's fiery death? How can a Christian remain true to their faith, which teaches, "Thou shalt not kill, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, turn the other cheek, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do, and the meek shall inherit the earth," unquote, while supporting any war, let alone this bit of cranky Yankee blind revenge? Maybe all the godless barbarians and aggressive heathens will wipe each other off the planet, hopefully, with luck. There you go. That's what I said 19 years ago in probably the second of my letters to the editor regarding the Afghan war that we got ourselves bogged in. As I recall it, the first one, what I asked was how many Australians were going to be sent to the psychiatric wards by post-traumatic stress disorder while fighting in America's war in Afghanistan. How many Australians were going to be killed in America's war against Afghanistan? And the answer turned out to be 42. That's how many Australians died in Afghanistan. Most of them as a result of blue on blue or blue on green or whatever they call it. When the Afghans that were being trained to fight against other Afghans suddenly decided they preferred to use their weapons against the Australians who were training them. But one really weird thing that has turned out in our long 19-year war against Afghanistan, because we've still got some combat troops over there. I don't know whether they're guarding the embassy or what. 42 Australians have died in 19 years of our occupation of Afghanistan. Something like 60 Australian Afghan war veterans have killed themselves since they came back to Australia. And combat veterans have twice the background suicide death rate of the society that they come out of. And military veterans have twice the suicide death rate of the society they come out of. But combat veterans' children, they have 3 times the suicide death rate of the society they come out of. So if we've had 50,000 Australians go to Afghanistan, I know we had 50,000 who went to Vietnam, maybe it's only 5,000 who've gone to Afghanistan. 5,000 who've gone to Afghanistan, 42 have got killed over there. 60 have killed themselves after they've come back. How many of them had kids? And how many of our Afghan veterans' children have killed themselves because they grew up in a family with a combat veteran for a parent? When I wrote the letter to the editor, the one that I couldn't find, I wasn't aware back then that combat veterans' children, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Statistics in 1998 and 2000, I don't think I'd read that report in 2001 when I was writing the newspaper letter. But yeah, I wasn't aware of that. So I didn't mention it in the letter. But I mention it now because I want to know how many children of Australia's Afghan veterans have killed themselves as a result of Johnny Howard's decision to send their parents, sometimes on 5 rotations, to a war where the best trained soldiers that we've got. What were the figures again? In 23 incidents over 7 years, 25 Australian personnel from the Special Air Services Regiment and the Commandos committed 39 unlawful killings of Afghan civilians and prisoners. 19 personnel have been referred for prosecution. 6 people have been let off because apparently they were ordered to kill prisoners because their sergeant, their corporal, or their warrant officer wanted them to be blooded in the same way that greyhounds are blooded against cats in order to make them go faster. As an Australian, I find myself offended at such a perversion of the idea of a nation's defence establishment. Now, we don't have a War Department. We have the Australian Defence Forces. We put up with the idea of people who volunteer to be trained to use death machines in peace so that if ever anybody attacks us, they're going to go out there and fight them on the beaches and do all those Churchillian things. We don't pay our sales tax to the, or goods and services tax collected by the states and given to the federal government. We don't do that to provide cut lunches for the commandos who are shooting people because we've got 7 prisoners and there's only room on the helicopter for 6. And that's what one of the American helicopter door gunners has testified. We don't employ people to go overseas and make Australia look like a bunch of randomly murderous, reckless killers. You know, like we don't want the Afghans to look on Australians in the same way that kangaroos and wallabies look on humans. Because if a kangaroo or a wallaby sees a human coming towards it in a car or on foot, they assume that that human has got a gun and will shoot them or otherwise go too fast at night and run them over. Those 25 SAS operators, they don't call themselves troopers anymore, they're operators, and the blokes from the commando regiment, they know who they are. They have been wandering the world stage on the taxpayers' expense, making Australia look as bad in the eyes of the rest of the world as kangaroos and swamp wallabies, and wallaroos as well, regard normal Australian humans. And you know what? Kangaroos and swamp wallabies think we're a mob of randomly murderous assholes. And what's going to happen from it? Well, 19 people are going to get referred to be considered for prosecution. I think some are going to get charged with murder. Some are going to get charged with accessory after the fact. I don't know what's going to happen to the people who obeyed illegal orders. But everybody from the SAS and everybody from the commandos who went to who went to Afghanistan for the 7 years in question, they just lost their unit merit citations. So they were no longer honourably discharging their duty to the nation, they were out there looking the other way while their mates were murdering the local civilians. Yeah? That's kind of calculated to make everybody in the SAS and the commandos decide that the people who have not yet been revealed, they are the arseholes in the story. It's a little bit of fairly blatant string pulling. I don't know how well it's going to go over in the military. I did hear one bloke this morning on the radio say that he's in the military. Maybe, no. His story is that he knows somebody who was in Afghanistan who was participant in over 100 gunfights, who attends a psychologist, and in order to get evidence from him, the bloke's psychologist had to be involved in the questioning. And one of the things that was revealed was that if that particular veteran serviceman had to give evidence against people that he served with in combat, he would kill himself. So there's going to be some really fucking difficult obstacles to getting the evidence necessary to prove in a court of law beyond all reasonable doubt that this, that, or the other Australian was a war criminal who murdered people, tortured people, ordered subservience to commit murder. It's going to be hard to prove. It's going to be hard to get the evidence. But I take my hat off to them for giving it their very best go, because otherwise we're going to be like the excited status of Norte Americano. There was a couple of SEALs who were accused and charged with war crimes, and a bloke called Trumpy pardoned them because, you know, like, you don't want to hold anybody accountable for anything, do you? That would be far too difficult, wouldn't it, mate? There you go. Will you testify that not all humans are randomly murderous assholes? If you were called upon in a court of law to tell the truth, the whole truth, and everything including the truth? Surely. Telling the truth matters. It matters a lot, doesn't it, eh? Any Wallaby bicoloraturer can tell you that. And the fact that the sort of person who thinks that all humans are randomly murderous arseholes is exactly the sort of person who finds themselves drawn to enlist voluntarily in the military and then do everything they can to become the hardest, strongest, toughest, most deadly super trooper that they can imagine in the forces. That's, well, some people would say it's a coincidence. I'm not one of those people. As an American Green Beret 2 tour US Vietnam veteran called David Grossman, Colonel, said, 60 days continuous combat experience turns 98% of participants into psychiatric casualties. The other 2%, they were sociopaths before they got into combat. They thrive in an environment where they are permitted and encouraged to kill other people. They win a lot of medals, but they suffer a lot of casualties because they cannot imagine themselves being hurt. 60 days continuous combat, 98% of participants become psychiatric casualties. The other 2% were sociopaths before going into combat. Professor David Grossman, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Would you like some more? You can have that. See? Not nearly as hungry now. So there you go, AceDestroyer. And now you know. That's what's come out so far into the great inquiry into what a bunch of bastards some Australians are when they're let loose with a gun and shipped halfway around the world. 1 or 3 or 5 different times for I think maybe half a year at a stretch. But pretty sure Canada completely disbanded their Special Air Services Regiment after a teenager was killed in Somalia in about 1993. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how far it goes. We'll see how much of the national honour the SAS and the commandos are able to redeem. Warple's on a lot to YouTube. Assholes always get their just desserts. Through the infinitely fractal karmic feedback loops within the cosmic scoreboard effect. It doesn't matter how much horse shit you were fed as a baby, neonate, infant, child, adolescent. When you grow up, when you become an adult, you're supposed to recognise that bullshit doesn't work, especially not in the long run. And torturing and killing civilians and prisoners for the national honour in the interest of personal survival, to work off your own fear in order to feel better about yourself as a warrior, that's just horse shit, you know. That's why they condemned people to death at the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Isn't that right? Eh? Ciao.